The ocean does not simply retreat at Inchon, it vanishes. It is a geological magic trick, a violent planetary exhalation that occurs twice a day, every day, stripping the harbour naked and exposing miles of grey, sucking mud that smells of ancient salt and decaying biological matter. For 12 hours there is no sea, only a vast, impassable wasteland of slime, capable of swallowing a man to his waist, a tank to its turret, and an army to its doom. Then, with the violence of a breaking dam, the Yellow Sea returns. It rushes back into the basin, not as a gentle tide, but as a turbulent, churning wall of water moving at 5 knots, raising the depth from 0 to 32 feet in a matter of hours. It is one of the most extreme tidal variances on Earth. To a military planner in 1950, looking at a hydrographic chart of the Korean peninsula, Inchon does not look like a landing zone. It looks like a suicide note. It is a geographic fortress designed by nature to reject invasion. There are no beaches, only 12-foot-high stone seawalls that smash the waves back into the harbour. There is no open water for manoeuvring, only the flying fish channel, a tortured, winding intestine of a waterway, so narrow that if one ship strikes a mine or suffers an engine failure, the entire invasion fleet is bottled up, paralyzed, and sitting as stationary targets for coastal artillery. And yet, on a humid evening in late August 1950, inside a humid command bunker north of the 38th parallel, a North Korean senior general and his Soviet advisors looked at this exact map. They traced the coastline with confident fingers. They looked at the mudflats, the seawalls, and the violent tides. They laughed. It was not a nervous laugh. It was the deep, resonant laughter of men who believe they have solved the equation of war. The Americans are desperate, the Soviet advisor noted, tapping the blue expanse of the Yellow Sea. But they are not insane. No commander in the history of warfare would attempt a landing here. The odds are 5,000 to 1 against it. Nature is our primary defender. The North Korean general nodded, dismissing the very idea of Inchon with a wave of his hand. He ordered the mines to be laid elsewhere, the heavy artillery to be concentrated south, and the reserves to be pushed toward the Pusan perimeter. He slept soundly that night, comforted by the absolute certainty of his enemy's limitations. He believed in the laws of physics. He believed in the impossibility of the geography. He did not know that in Tokyo, a man with a corncob pipe and an ego larger than the theatre of war itself was staring at the same map, not looking for a beach, but looking for a throat. And he did not know that the laws of physics were about to be bent by a terrifying combination of American engineering, desperate espionage, and a gamble so reckless it would shatter the spine of the North Korean People's Army in less than 24 hours. Before we dissect the anatomy of Yasi, this impossible landing, we must understand the systemic collapse that preceded it. By the summer of 1950, the Korean War was not a war, it was a rout. The North Korean People's Army, the KPA, had surged across the border like a hydraulic press, crushing the under-equipped and unprepared South Korean forces and the initial American units thrown in their path. The KPA was a machine built on Soviet doctrine, heavy armor, massed artillery, and relentless forward momentum. They drove T-34 tanks, the beasts that had broken the Wehrmacht, straight down the peninsula. The United Nations forces had been pushed into a tiny rectangular pocket on the southeastern tip of Korea known as the Pusan perimeter. It was a humiliating cage. Inside, tired men fought with their backs to the Sea of Japan. Outside, the KPA hammered against the lines day and night, probing for a weakness, bleeding the defenders white. The atmosphere inside the perimeter was one of claustrophobic dread. The heat was suffocating, a humid blanket that trapped the smell of cordite, unwashed bodies, and fear. General Walton Walker, commanding the 8th Army, had issued a stand or die order, but everyone knew that dying was the far more likely outcome if the geometry of the war didn't change. The conventional military solution was to pour more men into Busan, to build a wall of flesh and steel thick enough to stop the KPA hammer. It was a strategy of attrition, a grinding, bloody math problem where victory is measured in yards gained and thousands lost. But in Tokyo, at the Daiichi building, General Douglas MacArthur was looking at the map with the eyes of a predator, not a mathematician. He didn't want to stop the hammer, he wanted to cut the arm that held it. MacArthur understood the systemic weakness of the North Korean war machine. It was a creature of momentum. Its supply lines stretched all the way from the Yalu River in the north, down through Seoul and into the south. It was a long, exposed nerve cord. If you could sever that cord at its thinnest point, Seoul, the massive army besieging Busan, would instantly transform from a conquering force into a trapped, starving animal. The logic was sound. The target was obvious. Seoul was the nexus of all rail and road networks in Korea. Taking Seoul was the equivalent of putting a tourniquet on the enemy's neck, but the gateway to Seoul was Inchon. When MacArthur proposed the landing, the room went silent. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were horrified. The Navy, the men who actually had to drive the ships, were apoplectic. Rear Admiral James Doyle, a man who knew the sea better than MacArthur knew his own reflection, laid it out in brutal technical detail. "General," Doyle said, pointing to the charts, "we have a tidal range of 32 feet. We have a channel so narrow that two ships cannot pass each other. We have mud flats that extend 3 miles out at low tide. We have no beaches, only 12-foot stone walls that our landing craft cannot climb. And we have exactly 3 days in the entire month of September where the tide is high enough to even attempt this. If we miss that window, we wait a month. If we get stuck in the mud, we are dead." The Navy presented the 5,000 to 1 statistic. They listed the geographical obstacles like a prosecutor listing crimes. They talked about the currents, the lack of maneuvering room, the fact that the Marines would have to scale seawalls with ladders while under fire, like medieval knights storming a castle. MacArthur listened. He sat in his chair, puffing on his pipe, letting the weight of the impossibility fill the room. Then he used their own logic against them. He argued that the very impossibility of the operation was its greatest asset. The North Koreans were rational actors. They had Soviet advisors who calculated risk based on doctrine and probability. They would look at Inchon and see a fortress of nature. They would leave it lightly defended because no sane army would attack there. "The very arguments you have made as to the impracticabilities involved," MacArthur intoned, his voice dropping to a theatrical hush, "will tend to ensure for me the element of surprise. For the enemy commander will reason that no one would be so brash as to make such an attempt." It was a psychological gamble disguised as a strategic imperative. MacArthur was betting that the North Korean generals were too smart for their own good. He was betting that their reliance on logic would be their undoing. He authorized Operation Chromite. The date was set for September 15th. The clock began to tick, not just against the enemy, but against the moon itself. But a gamble requires more than intuition. It requires data. You cannot land a corps of Marines on a hunch. The ghost effect MacArthur needed, the ability to appear where he shouldn't exist, required a level of granular, technical intelligence that simply didn't exist. The charts were old. The Japanese data from the occupation was suspect. No one knew if the sea walls had been reinforced. No one knew the exact consistency of the mud. This is where the story shifts from the high command to the dark, wet reality of espionage. Enter Lieutenant Eugene Clark, a Navy intelligence officer who looked more like a college professor than a commando. 2 weeks before the landing, Clark led a small team of South Korean agents onto the island of Yonghung-do, right at the mouth of the Inchon harbor. This was not a James Bond movie. There were no tuxedos, no martinis. This was dirty, terrifying work in the dark. Clark and his men lived in the shadow of the enemy. They hid in the brush by day and worked by night. Their mission was a technical autopsy of the harbor before the patient was even dead. They needed to measure the mud. It sounds trivial, but it was the difference between life and death. If the mud was too soft, the tanks and trucks would sink. If it was too hard, the landing craft might ground too far out. Clark would wade out into the freezing slime at low tide, sinking to his chest, feeling the texture of the harbor floor. He measured the seawalls, counting the feet, calculating the length of the ladders the Marines would need. One night, Clark crawled to the edge of the mud flats and watched the North Korean patrols. He noted the timing of their lights, the rhythm of their sentries. He realized something critical. The defense was indeed light. The arrogance of the North Korean command was visible in the laziness of the patrols. They weren't watching the sea because the sea was supposed to be their ally. But Clark's most vital target was the lighthouse on Palmy Doe. This solitary beacon marked the entrance to the Flying Fish Channel. Without it, the invasion fleet, navigating through a typhoon-churned sea in pitch blackness, would never find the narrow gut of the channel. The lighthouse was dark, disabled by the North Koreans. Clark knew that, on the night of the 15th, he would have to manually relight that lamp, or the entire operation would crash onto the rocks. While Clark was measuring mud, the invasion fleet was assembling. It was a logistical leviathan, 261 ships, 70,000 men. It was a floating city of steel and gasoline, drawn from every corner of the Pacific. But nature, as if offended by MacArthur's arrogance, threw one final obstacle in the path. Typhoon Kezia. A massive storm swept through the Yellow Sea just days before the landing. Winds hit 125 miles per hour. The fleet, trying to converge on Inchon, was battered. LST's landing ship tank, flat-bottomed wallowing tubs that were never designed for rough seas, were tossed like corks. Inside, thousands of Marines were violently ill, vomiting until there was nothing left. Their bodies slammed against the steel bulkheads. The psychological toll was immense. These men were about to assault a fortified city, and they were arriving exhausted, dehydrated, and battered by the ocean. But the storm also provided the final layer of the cloak. To the North Korean radar operators and coastal watchers, the idea of an invasion fleet moving through a typhoon was ludicrous. The storm was the ultimate camouflage. The noise of the wind masked the thrum of the engines. The rain blinded the lookouts. On the morning of September 15th, the impossible happened. The tide began to rush in. The geological magic trick reversed itself. The mudflats were swallowed by the grey water, and riding that surge, like a surfer catching a monster wave, came the United Nations fleet. The timing had to be perfect. The tide at Inchon doesn't just rise, it peaks and then immediately recedes. The window for the first wave to land, secure the beachhead, and unload the initial supplies was incredibly short. If they missed it, the ships would be stranded in the mud, sitting ducks for the KPA artillery. The bombardment began at dawn. Cruisers and destroyers, risking grounding in the narrow channel, opened fire at point-blank range. The sky turned orange. The sound was a physical weight, pressing down on the chest. On the island of Palmy Doe, the linchpin of the Inchon defenses, the ground simply erupted. Then came the LSTs. These were the workhorses of the invasion, ugly, slow, and indispensable. They carried the tanks, the bulldozers, the ammunition. But at Inchon, they faced a problem that had no precedent in amphibious warfare: the sea walls. You cannot drive a landing craft onto a stone wall. The ramp drops and you are staring at 12 feet of granite. The solution was crude, brilliant, and terrifyingly simple: aluminum ladders. The Marines had built scaling ladders, complete with hooks at the top. As the LSTs ground against the seawalls, swaying in the violent current, the Marines threw the ladders up and scrambled over the top. It was a scene from a siege in the Middle Ages, transposed into the atomic age. Men climbing walls while machine gun fire chipped the stone around their hands. But the surprise was total. The North Korean defenders in the bunkers were stunned. They had been told repeatedly by their officers and their Soviet advisors that this could not happen. They were fighting ghosts, an enemy that had materialized out of the mud, an enemy that physics said should not be there. The resistance on Wolmi-do crumbled in minutes. The Marines secured the island, but the main landing, the assault on Inchon city itself, had to wait for the evening tide. For 12 agonizing hours, the Marines on Wolmi-do sat isolated, watching the water drain away, watching the mud return, waiting for the fleet to come back. When the evening tide surged in, the main force struck. They hit Red Beach and Blue Beach. They climbed the walls. They bulldozed breaches in the stone. And then the systemic shockwave began. To understand the magnitude of the North Korean collapse, you have to look away from the beaches and look at the map of the entire peninsula. The North Korean army was a beast with a massive head and a very long neck. The head was in Busan, hammering against the Americans. The neck ran through Seoul. When the Marines took Inchon and pushed rapidly inland toward Seoul, they didn't just capture territory, they severed the spinal cord. Suddenly, the hundreds of thousands of KPA troops in the south, the men who had been fighting so ferociously, were cut off. No food, no ammunition, no fuel for the T-34s, no orders from Pyongyang. The psychological impact was devastating. A modern army relies on the belief that its rear is secure. It relies on the flow of supplies like a body relies on blood. When that flow stops, panic sets in. The ghost effect of Inchon rippled down the peninsula. Rumors flew through the KPA ranks. The Americans are behind us. Seoul has fallen. We are trapped. The North Korean generals, the ones who had laughed at the map, were now staring at it in horror. The impossible had become the inevitable. Their rigid adherence to doctrine, their belief that the enemy would do what was logical, had blinded them to the audacity of the risk. They had prepared for a hammer blow at Busan. They got a knife in the back at Inchon. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. Within days, the Marines were fighting in the streets of Seoul. The KPA units in the south, realizing they were in a giant sack, disintegrated. The organized withdrawal turned into a chaotic rout. Soldiers threw away their weapons and melted into the countryside. Tanks were abandoned on the roadsides, their fuel tanks dry, their crews fled. The army that had nearly pushed the United Nations into the sea simply evaporated. Technically, the operation was a masterpiece of timing and engineering. The Navy had navigated the Flying Fish Channel without losing a major ship. The Marines had scaled the walls. The logistics officers had managed to unload thousands of tons of supplies on a schedule dictated by the moon. But the real victory was cognitive. It was a victory of imagination over dogma. The Soviet advisors had looked at the data and seen a wall. MacArthur had looked at the data and seen a door. Let's go back to that bunker in the north, to the moment the reports started coming in. Imagine the silence, the phone ringing, the frantic voice on the other end screaming that there are American tanks in Inchon. The general looking at the Soviet advisor, the advisor looking at the map, the same map that promised them safety. The arrogance of that opening scene, the dismissal of the threat, the reliance on the 5,000 to 1 odds was not just a mistake, it was a symptom of a systemic blindness. They believed that the constraints of reality applied equally to everyone. They believed that because they couldn't imagine landing at Inchon, the Americans couldn't do it. They failed to account for the variable of desperation and the variable of technological ingenuity. The ghost effect was real. The KPA was fighting an enemy that could manipulate the geography of the battlefield. By controlling the sea, the United Nations forces could turn the flanks of any position, no matter how strong. The peninsula, which the KPA saw as a corridor for tanks, was actually a trap for anyone who didn't control the water. In the aftermath, the statistics were staggering. The Inchon landing and the subsequent breakout cost the North Korean army 135,000 men in prisoners and casualties. It effectively destroyed the KPA as a fighting force in South Korea. The ratio of loss was catastrophic. For every American casualty at Inchon, the North Koreans lost entire battalions in the systemic collapse that followed. But the lesson of Inchon goes deeper than the numbers. It is a lesson about the danger of certainty. In war and in systems of high-stakes conflict, the moment you decide something is impossible is the moment you become vulnerable to it. The impossible is often just a problem waiting for a specific high-risk solution. The North Korean generals were stunned not because they were incompetent, but because they were conventional. They were playing chess, moving pieces according to established rules. MacArthur was playing poker, betting everything on a hand that shouldn't have won. As the sun set over the Yellow Sea on September 16th, the mudflats of Inchon were once again exposed, glistening in the twilight. The tide sucked away, revealing the debris of the invasion, wrecked landing craft, discarded equipment, the scars of the bombardment. But the map had changed forever. The fortress of nature had been breached. The laughter in the bunker had been silenced, replaced by the terrifying realization that in a war of systems, the side that can rewrite the rules of the environment is the side that wins. The mud at Inchon is still there. The tides still rip through the channel at 5 knots. The seawalls still stand. But to the student of military history, they are no longer just geographic features. They are a monument to the moment when an army was cut in half because its leaders believed that the ocean would protect them. They forgot that the ocean, like war itself, is indifferent to your assumptions. It only respects those who know how to ride the wave. To understand the granular texture of this operation, we must descend from the strategic view of the generals and stand in the boots of the men who had to execute the impossible. The Blue Beach landing, specifically, offers a microscopic view of the chaos and precision involved. Blue Beach was located south of the city, an industrial zone of salt pans and smokestacks. The approach was a nightmare. The smoke from the burning city, ignited by the naval bombardment and airstrikes, drifted over the water, mixing with the rain and the twilight gloom. The coxswains driving the landing craft were effectively blind. They were navigating by compass and by the flashes of gunfire on the shore. As the first wave approached, the beach revealed itself to be a high revetment of black mud and stone. The LVT landing vehicle tracked. Amtraks designed to crawl from water to land struggled for traction. The mud at Blue Beach was particularly vicious, a deep alluvial silt that acted like quicksand. One Marine officer looking over the ramp of his craft later described the sensation as landing on the moon, if the moon was made of glue and on fire. The noise was deafening. The roar of the Amtrak engines, the scream of jets overhead, the crump of mortars landing in the water. But amidst this cacophony, there was a strange, pervasive sense of unreality. The North Korean defenders at Blue Beach were dazed. The bombardment had shattered their communications. Their officers were dead or missing. When the Marines came out of the smoke, clambering up the sea walls and slogging through the salt pans, the KPA soldiers didn't react with the coordinated discipline of the veteran units that had smashed the South. They reacted with the frantic, disjointed panic of men waking up in a burning house. This is where the systemic conflict mentioned earlier becomes tangible. The American system emphasized initiative at the lowest level. If a lieutenant died, the sergeant took over. If the radio broke, the squad improvised. The objective was clear: get inland, cut the road, seal the city. The North Korean system, modeled on the Soviet rigidity of 1950, was top-heavy. It relied on detailed orders from above. When the above was silenced by naval gunfire, the below froze. At Blue Beach, KPA squads were found huddled in their bunkers, weapons trained on the wrong approaches, waiting for orders that would never come. They were paralyzed by the speed of the American OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. While the Marines were fighting through the industrial district, the Army's 7th Infantry Division was beginning to unload. This was the follow-up punch. And here, the logistical genius of the operation shone. The port of Inchon was a wreck. The cranes were destroyed, the piers damaged. Yet, the Americans brought their own port with them. They used pontoon causeways, floating steel bridges that could be snapped together like Lego bricks. They drove bulldozers off the front of LSTs directly onto these pontoons, creating instant piers. They brought floodlights, generators, and traffic control officers. Within hours of the first assault, the beachhead was transformed into a functioning industrial hub. Trucks were rolling off ships, loaded with ammunition, and driving straight to the front lines. Contrast this with the KPA supply line. At that very moment, a North Korean truck driver heading south from Pyongyang would have been navigating a road network pulverized by American air power. He would be driving at night without lights to avoid the prowling F-80 Shooting Stars and F-4U Corsairs. He would be dodging craters, delayed by wrecked bridges, and constantly harassed by the fear of death from above. The American supply line at Inchon was a short, fat pipe pumping steel directly into the enemy's rear. The North Korean supply line was a long, leaking capillary, bleeding out over hundreds of miles. The outcome of the battle was decided by this logistical asymmetry as much as by the bullets fired. Let's return to the arrogance scene for a moment. The Soviet advisors had calculated the tonnage required to support an invasion. They knew how many tons of fuel, food, and ammo a division consumes per day. They looked at the capacity of Inchon's harbor, the limited piers, the tidal restrictions, and their slide rules told them it was impossible to offload that much tonnage in that specific window. They were right about the math of a conventional port. They were wrong about the American capacity for improvisation. They didn't anticipate the LSTs grounding themselves on purpose. This was a key innovation. The Americans deliberately drove their LSTs onto the mud at high tide and let the water rush out, leaving the ships high and dry. They then opened the bow doors and drove the trucks directly onto the mud, reinforced with mats or the sand. They turned the ships into stationary warehouses. When the tide came back in 12 hours later, the ships floated and they pulled out. It was a rhythm of violence synchronized with the moon. Ground, unload, float, retreat. Repeat. The Soviet doctrine had no chapter for using the tide as a conveyor belt. The killer humbling moment for the KPA leadership likely came roughly 48 hours after the landing. It wasn't the fall of Inchon itself, but the capture of Kimpo Airfield. Kimpo was the largest airfield in Korea, located between Inchon and Seoul. Its capture meant that American aircraft could now operate from land bases right next to the front lines, rather than flying from carriers or from Japan. When Kimpo fell, the ghost effect became permanent. The Americans were no longer just a raiding party, they were residents. They had an airport. They were bringing in C-54 transport planes. The door was not just kicked open, it was taken off the hinges. General MacArthur, ever the showman, landed at Kimpo shortly after it was secured. He stepped off the plane, pipe in hand, into the dust and noise of the war zone. It was the ultimate rebuke to the skeptics. The man who had been told he was sending his army to a grave of mud was now standing on a runway in the enemy's backyard, preparing to hand the keys of Seoul back to the South Korean president. But we must not sanitize the horror of the urban combat that followed. The fight for Seoul was brutal. The KPA, once they recovered from the initial shock, fought with desperate tenacity. They barricaded the streets. They turned buildings into fortresses. The Marines had to clear the city block by block, using flamethrowers and tanks to burn out the defenders. Yet, even in this street fighting, the cut at Inchon was the deciding factor. The KPA defenders in Seoul were fighting without hope of relief. They knew no reinforcements were coming from the south. Those units were disintegrating. They knew no supplies were coming from the north. The Americans controlled the air and the roads. They were fighting in a vacuum. The psychological weight of encirclement is heavy. It saps the will to fight. A soldier who knows he has a line of retreat will fight differently than a soldier who knows he is in a cage. The Inchon landing built that cage. The intelligence war didn't stop with the landing. Throughout the operation, Eugene Clark and his team continued to operate, now shifting from hydrography to targeting. They identified KPA command posts, ammunition dumps, and troop concentrations, radioing the coordinates to the fleet. The ghosts were now spotting for the artillery. There is a specific story about a North Korean colonel captured near Suwon, south of Seoul. When interrogated, he was in a state of shock. He kept asking, "Where did you come from?" He couldn't process the geometry of the battlefield. In his mind, the war was in the south. The enemy was in front of him. The idea that an entire army corps was suddenly behind him broke his mental model of the world. This cognitive dissonance is the hallmark of a successful systemic attack. You don't just defeat the enemy's body, you break their mind. You force them to question reality. The Inchon landing was a form of gaslighting on a strategic scale. It convinced the North Korean army that they were safe, right up until the moment the knife went in. The legacy of Inchon is complex. It saved South Korea from annihilation. It restored the status quo ante bellum. But it also emboldened MacArthur to push north toward the Yalu River, triggering the intervention of the Chinese and widening the war into a bloody stalemate that lasted 3 more years. The brilliance of the landing led to the hubris of the advance. However, focusing strictly on the operation itself, it remains the gold standard of amphibious warfare. It is studied in every war college in the world. It is the counter-argument to every officer who says, "We can't do that because the manual says X." The manual is a collection of past solutions to past problems. It is a guide, not a god. The North Koreans worshipped the manual. They worshipped the geography. They believed that the mud was a neutral arbiter that would stop anyone foolish enough to try. They forgot that war is an act of human will. The mud doesn't care who crosses it as long as they have the right boots. The tide doesn't care who rides it as long as they have the right timing. As we look back at the arrogance seen in the bunker, we can now see it with full clarity. The laughter of the general and the advisor was the laughter of men who had mistaken a difficult problem for an impossible one. They saw the 32-foot tides as a wall. MacArthur saw them as an elevator. They saw the mudflats as a trap. MacArthur saw them as a highway that was only open for a few hours a day. The philosophical epilogue of this event is stark. In any conflict, business, technology, or war, there is always a flying fish channel. There is always a path that everyone agrees is too dangerous, too narrow, or too difficult. And usually they are right. It is dangerous. It is narrow. But if you can solve the specific technical variables that make it dangerous, if you can measure the mud, light the lighthouse, and build the ladders, then that path becomes the most devastating vector of attack precisely because no one is guarding it. The North Korean generals were stunned because they were looking at the world as it was, not as it could be manipulated to be. They were static observers of a dynamic system, and in the end, they were defeated not by a bigger army, but by a better idea. The image of the Inchon landing that lingers is not the flag raising or the victory parade. It is the image of a single LST, grounded in the grey mud, its bow doors open, vomiting a stream of trucks onto the wet silt while the moon pulls the ocean away. It is a picture of industrial defiance against the planet itself. It is the moment when the impossible simply became a matter of logistics. And somewhere in the ruins of a command bunker, a map still hangs on the wall, marked with the confident blue lines of a defense that never stood a chance against the ghost fleet that rode the tide. The silence in that room is the sound of a paradigm shattering. The stunning realization that the wall you built to keep the enemy out was actually the wall that kept you in. The ghost effect lingers. Even today, military planners look at the map of Korea and see the ghost of MacArthur's gamble. They see the vulnerability of extended supply lines. They see the danger of assuming that geography is destiny. In the end, the Inchon landing cut the North Korean army in half, but it also cut through the fog of conventional wisdom. It proved that in the calculus of war, the variable of audacity, when backed by cold, hard technical competence, is worth more than 5,000 tons of concrete. The mud of Inchon remembers, and so do the ghosts of the army that vanished in its grip. The final tally of the operation is a testament to the power of the indirect approach. The United Nations forces suffered approximately 3,500 casualties during the entire Inchon-Seoul campaign. The North Korean forces suffered over 14,000 killed and countless thousands captured or dispersed. It was a trade of nearly 10-to-1 in favor of the attacker, a ratio that defies the traditional laws of warfare, which usually state that the attacker needs a 3-to-1 advantage just to break even. This statistical anomaly was the direct result of the systemic shock. The KPA soldiers weren't just outfought, they were outpositioned. They were fighting a battle that had already been decided on the map days before the first shot was fired. When the dust settled, the invincible KPA war machine lay in ruins, a victim of its own success and its own blindness. They had driven so far, so fast, that they had stretched their neck out on the chopping block. All MacArthur had to do was swing the axe. And the sound of that axe falling, the roar of the naval guns, the splash of the anchors, the clank of the tank treads on the seawall, echoes down through history as a warning to anyone who thinks they are safe behind a wall of impossible. The tide always returns. The question is, will you be riding it, or will you be drowning in it? The investigation of Inchon is an autopsy of surprise. It reveals that surprise is not just about jumping out from behind a bush. It is about technical capability. It is about doing what the enemy knows you cannot do. The North Koreans knew the Americans couldn't land at Inchon because they didn't have the ships, the tides, or the daring. They were wrong on all three counts. The Ghost Fleet was real. It was made of steel and oil and men who were scared to death but went anyway. It appeared out of the rain and the typhoon, a phantom armada that turned the tide of history. And in the silence that followed the collapse of the North Korean army, one truth remained standing among the wreckage. The only thing more dangerous than a desperate enemy is an enemy who has done the math that you were too arrogant to check. The mudflats of Inchon are quiet now. The modern city of Inchon has grown over the landing sites. The sea walls are part of a bustling port. But if you stand there at low tide, when the smell of the salt and the silt rises up, you can almost hear the echo of the laughter in the bunker and the sudden, terrible silence that followed when the ghosts came out of the sea. The impossible is just a word used by men who haven't measured the mud. The final lesson is one of humility. The North Korean generals were not stupid men. They were professionals. They had conquered most of a country in weeks. Their error was not incompetence, it was a failure of imagination. They could not imagine a world where the rules of the sea could be bent. MacArthur, for all his flaws, for all his vanity, had the capacity to imagine the impossible. He saw the Flying Fish Channel not as a barrier, but as a key. And he turned it. The door opened, the army broke, and the war changed forever. This is the story of how a map, a tide, and a gamble destroyed an army. It is the story of the Inchon landing. And it is a reminder that in the face of systemic arrogance, the most dangerous weapon is the one you never see coming. The ghost effect is the ultimate advantage, to be everywhere and nowhere, to be the tide itself. As the history books closed on 1950, the stunning reversal at Inchon stood as the defining moment of the early Cold War. It demonstrated that the West was not just a collection of decaying democracies, but a force capable of technological and strategic brilliance. It sent a shockwave through Moscow and Beijing. It forced a recalculation of the global balance of power. But for the men on the ground, the Marines in the mud, the KPA soldiers in the trap, it wasn't about geopolitics. It was about the visceral reality of sudden, overwhelming change. 1 minute, you are the conqueror. The next, you are the prey. The transition was instantaneous. It was triggered by the arrival of the fleet that shouldn't have been there. And that is the terrifying beauty of Inchon. It was a singularity. A point in time where the impossible became real and the arrogant became humble. The generals were stunned, the army was cut in half, and the sea, indifferent to it all, continued its eternal rhythm, in and out, revealing the mud and hiding it again. A cycle of revelation and concealment that mirrors the art of war itself. The flying fish channel waits, the mud waits, and the lesson remains: never tell the ocean what it cannot do.